I had exactly 14,820 left in my checking account, a surgical scar still pulling tight every time I stood too fast, and a silver USB drive that had arrived in a padded envelope 6 hours before my sister-in-law planned to stand under a chandelier in downtown Savannah and accept applause for saving the family company she had nearly buried me to steal. I remember dropping one of my blood pressure pills on the kitchen tile and having to crouch slowly to pick it up because my hands were shaking more than they should have been. The betrayal was precise. 9 months earlier, while I was out on medical leave after bypass surgery, $2.4 million had been moved through a vendor account I supposedly approved, and the paper trail pointed straight at me. They called it embezzlement. The USB had no return address, only my name in block letters and one sentence on the packing slip. Check the timestamps before the gala. By then, there was already a petition in Chatham County Superior Court waiting to be filed if I chose the right moment. Let me take you back. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 58 years old then, founder and operations director of Mercer Restoration Group, a mid-sized historic renovation firm that made its money the slow way, with insurance work, municipal contracts, and the kind of reputation that takes 20 years to build and 20 minutes to destroy. My flaw, if I am being honest, was one I used to dress up as loyalty. I stayed too long. I excused too much. I mistook endurance for wisdom. My late brother Jonah used to say I had a bad habit of calling rot weather and waiting for it to pass. He had been dead for 6 years by the time his widow, Vanessa Hale Mercer, decided I was useful as a fall guy. She was elegant in the way some expensive hotels are elegant, polished on the surface, quietly merciless in the plumbing. Vanessa married Jonah when our company was still 2 pickup trucks, 1 office trailer, and a line of credit that kept me awake at night. After Jonah died from a stroke at 49, I kept her on as chief financial officer because she had a finance degree, a composed voice, and a grief so cleanly worn it made everyone around her gentler than they should have been. My mother adored her. The board trusted her. Donors from the Preservation Foundation liked having her at luncheons because she knew which fork to touch and which story to tell. Then I got sick. Triple bypass in Atlanta, 6 weeks out, then 10. The surgeons were excellent. Recovery was slower than I admitted to anyone. I would sit at home in Isle of Hope with a blanket over my legs trying to answer emails, and sometimes I would read the same line 3 times before it stayed in my head. That was when Vanessa moved. Not all at once. Smart thieves rarely do. She used a shell vendor called Tidal Civic Consulting, approved emergency invoice batches during a courthouse roofing project, and pushed them through our escrow draw schedule as historical mitigation consultants. It sounded boring enough to live. When the bank flagged irregularities, she did not panic. She produced an affidavit packet. There were signatures that looked like mine, email approvals sent from my account, and a notarized authorization letter dated 3 days after my surgery, a day I barely remembered beyond the sound of nurses changing shifts. The company froze me out. The city suspended our contracts. My access was revoked before I could finish reading the board notice. The deadline came from our outside counsel, a man named Trent Lasker, who delivered career-ending sentences in a voice suited for dinner reservations. "Daniel," he said over speakerphone while I sat in my own dining room in a t-shirt and compression socks, "if you miss this, you lose everything." He meant the mediation window. Sign a resignation, waive claims, accept civil liability quietly, spare the company criminal exposure, spare the family public embarrassment. In return, they would not push for prosecution. I remember putting the phone face down. Then I waited. I did not sign that day, though part of me wanted to, just to stop hearing my mother cry. She was 81, arthritic, and still living in the old family house near Ardsley Park, the same white-columned place Jonah had promised would stay in a trust for blood family, no matter what happened. That promise would matter later. The history between Vanessa and me had never been loud. Loud cruelty is easy to spot. Hers was cleaner. Jonah had been the golden child without ever meaning to be. He was handsome, charming, effortless. I was the one who stayed late, fixed payroll errors, and learned where every permit clerk in 3 counties kept the missing forms. After Jonah died, that family imbalance did not disappear. It simply transferred. At my mother's 75th birthday dinner, before any of this started, Vanessa had lifted her wine glass and smiled across the table. "Daniel keeps us stable," she said. "Jonah gave us vision. Every family needs both kinds of people." Everyone nodded like she had paid me a compliment. I remember the butter cooling on my plate. The second incident was worse because it came when I was weak enough to hear it clearly. 3 weeks after surgery, I came into the office against medical advice because payroll had gone sideways. I found Vanessa in the conference room with 2 junior managers and a lender. She did not know I was outside the door. "One thing about Daniel," she said, calm as weather, "he confuses being necessary with being irreplaceable." No laughter followed. That was almost worse. By the time the board pushed me out, she was already acting CEO, already drafting the story people would tell each other at church, at galas, in private text threads with too many exclamation points. Poor Vanessa. Imagine inheriting this mess. Imagine carrying the company through fraud and reputational damage. I would have been finished if not for 2 things. The first was that I knew my own habits too well to miss what had been staged. The emails attributed to me were too neat. I dictate rough, I revise late. The grammar was technically mine and rhythmically wrong. The second was a woman named Elise Moreno. Officially, Elise was our contracts compliance manager, 34 years old, careful, underpaid, and so invisible to executives that Vanessa once asked her to refill a water pitcher at a board meeting because she thought Elise worked for catering. In reality, Elise knew the architecture of our approvals better than anyone. She visited me 2 days after the mediation threat, carrying soup I did not ask for, and a banker's box I did. "These invoice chains are wrong," she said, standing in my kitchen like she had no interest in being dramatic. "Not morally wrong, technically wrong, which is better." She showed me how the vendor onboarding packet for Title Civic Consulting used a digital certificate issued at 2:13 a.m. from a machine that had never touched our office network before. She showed me the notary stamp, real stamp, wrong commission county. She showed me an email export with server metadata that placed one of my approvals in the office, while my cardiology chart showed I was sedated 40 miles away. "This matters because feelings don't win injunctions," she said. "Metadata does." That was the first time in months I felt the room steady. We pulled more, quietly. Not from company servers, I no longer had access. From city procurement copies, subcontractor records, and a backup archive Elise had created because she did not trust anyone who dressed too well during a fiscal quarter. The second folder changed everything. Inside it was a board memo Vanessa had circulated privately regarding a fundraising merger with the Coastal Heritage Foundation. On page 4, attached almost lazily, sat a draft of an amended operating agreement for Mercer Restoration Group. Hidden in the legal language was a fraud carve-out tied to what our counsel called a canary clause. Elise had to explain that one in plain English. "If a managing officer lies to the board about theft exposure," she said, tapping the paragraph, "this clause forces immediate suspension of voting rights, triggers forensic audit access, and blocks transfer of trust-protected assets to non-blood beneficiaries." I looked at her. "In English," I said. "In English, if Vanessa built her control by lying about your theft, she loses the company and she loses any path to your mother's house." That house was the innocent center of all of it. My mother still set 2 extra plates every Thanksgiving, one for Jonah, one for the grandson she lost at birth decades ago. Rituals like that are not logical. They are sacred anyway. Vanessa had been maneuvering to move her into assisted living and sell the property under a stewardship restructure. That phrase still makes me tired. The villain escalation came 3 days before the gala. Vanessa called me herself for the first time in months. I let it ring twice before answering. "Daniel," she said, smooth as marble, "I'm glad you picked up." "Are you?" "I wanted to give you a chance to be sensible. There's going to be press at the charity event Friday, donors, board members, a state preservation grant officer. You understand what happens if you show up making claims you can't prove." I leaned back slowly because my chest still ached when I forgot myself. "What happens?" "You become the bitter man who got caught," she said, "and your mother becomes collateral damage." That was the humiliation threat. Not just ruin me, shrink me, make me look unwell, unstable, resentful, make her elegance do the rest. I said, "You sound very confident." Because I'm holding the only narrative anyone will believe. I almost told her about the server timestamps, about the affidavit defects, about the USB I still had not opened because I wanted every surprise where I could use it best. Instead, I said the only sentence that mattered. This isn't revenge. This is justice. She gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they think they are already standing on the winner's platform. Justice, she said. How serious? Then she hung up. I opened the USB that night. It contained 2 video files, 1 scanned deed packet, and a typed note. The deed packet showed Vanessa had quietly formed a second LLC, Harbor Willow Holdings, and used it to position herself for a post-merger asset transfer if Mercer Restoration collapsed. The videos were better. The first was office security footage from the side conference room, date-stamped from the week of my surgery. No audio, but clear enough. Vanessa sliding papers across the table to Trent Lasker, Trent pointing to signature blocks, Vanessa handing over a folder. The second clip was shorter and uglier. A close angle from a hallway camera. Trent himself applying our office seal to a notary page after hours. I watched both twice. The note on the drive said, "I sent this because she promised I'd be protected." I was not. Use it well. There was no name. I thought the anonymous sender was some frightened admin or junior lawyer. I was wrong. That was the ally twist, though I did not know it yet. The gala was supposed to be held in the glass ballroom at the Bryce House Annex on Bay Street, all warm light and river views and old money preservation talk. At noon, a coastal storm rolled in harder than forecast. By 3, a transformer issue knocked out half the district. The event was moved across the square to the Mercer Civic Museum, a backup venue we had renovated ourselves 5 years earlier. Smaller room, lower ceiling, better acoustics, no stage wings, no easy exits. Sometimes weather does better cross-examination than lawyers. Elise came with me. So did Miriam Cole, my litigation attorney, a former federal clerk with the expression of a woman who already knows where your documents fail. She had reviewed everything in 48 hours, prepared a petition for emergency injunctive relief, and lined up a forensic accountant named Raj Bedi to explain the money flow if given a microphone and 10 uninterrupted minutes. "You understand," Miriam told me in the museum parking lot while rain patterned across the windshield. "We are not doing theater. We are creating a record in front of witnesses whose opinions matter before we file." I nodded. "If Vanessa says anything actionable, we move tonight," she said. "What about Trent?" Her mouth tightened. "Trent will have his own evening." Inside, the room smelled like damp wool and polished wood. Donors in navy and pearl. Board members pretending inconvenience made them noble. I kept to the back at first. No speeches, no scene. Vanessa stood near the podium in ivory silk, hand resting lightly on the shoulder of board chair Walter Sisson, a man who collected maritime paintings and trusted confidence far too much. Then came the second twist. The museum's interim director approached Miriam, murmured something, and looked at me with a face I recognized but could not place. Mid-40s, trim beard. Catering earpiece earlier in the evening. He introduced himself quietly. "Gavin Lasker," he said. I looked at him, then at the surname. "Trent's brother?" "Half-brother," he said, "and the one he has spent 15 years underestimating." He was the anonymous sender. Vanessa had hired his museum events team through a donor connection and apparently never realized Gavin had once done digital security consulting before moving into nonprofit administration. He had pulled the hallway footage after seeing Trent access restricted records at the prior venue months earlier during merger planning. He had confronted him privately. Trent denied everything. So Gavin sent the files to me when he saw the gala guest list and understood what was coming. "I won't testify tonight without subpoena," Gavin said. "But if you file, I'll give a statement." That was enough. Vanessa's speech began 40 minutes late. She thanked sponsors, mentioned resilience, mentioned stewardship, mentioned surviving betrayal from within, with exactly the right pause afterward. People murmured. A few looked toward me standing by the back column because word travels faster in tight rooms. Then she invited the board chair to join her in announcing the merger framework. Walter took the podium. "Tonight," he said, "we recognize the courage it takes to protect an institution even when personal relationships must be sacrificed." That was when Miriam touched my sleeve once. "Now." I did not rush. Speed is for panic. I walked forward until people had to make room. Rain drummed faintly against the museum windows. Vanessa saw me at the third row and kept smiling, but it thinned around the edges. "Mr. Sisson," Miriam said clearly, "before any vote or public representation continues, you need notice of material fraud under Section 8.4 of the amended operating agreement you were circulated on April 12th. Walter blinked. "Excuse me?" Miriam handed him the binder. Raj handed another to two board members. Elise handed one to the foundation grant officer. That was the small reveal. Vanessa stepped away from the podium. "This is inappropriate." Miriam did not look at her. "The clause your CFO inserted and relied upon for governance authority contains a fraud, carve-out, and canary provision. In plain terms, once the board has noticed that management fabricated a theft narrative to obtain control, voting rights suspend immediately, and an independent forensic audit becomes mandatory." Walter started turning pages faster. Vanessa said, "Daniel, don't do this here." I looked at her and felt, strangely, no heat at all. "You chose here." That was the bigger reveal. Raj opened the financial flowcharts on an easel one of the museum staff had wheeled in at Miriam's request, under the pretense of donor visuals. He explained the Shell LLC, the invoice path, the escrow diversion, and the timing conflict between my medical sedation record and the authorization documents. He kept his language painfully simple. Money moved from Mercer Restoration to Tidal Civic Consulting. Tidal's account then paid Harbor Willow Holdings. Harbor Willow is controlled by Ms. Mercer. These transfers occurred during periods when Mr. Mercer was hospitalized or lacked system access. The supporting approval emails were generated from an office endpoint assigned to executive administration, not from his residence or mobile device. Vanessa tried to interrupt. Miriam said, "Please don't. It gets worse." Then came nuclear. Gavin from the side wall raised one hand. "The museum can provide chain of custody authentication for 2 security files relevant to council misconduct." Every head turned. Trent Lasker, who had arrived late and been standing near the donor table, went still in a way I have only seen in men who know exactly which lie is about to fail. Miriam connected a projector already waiting on the museum laptop. No dramatics, no swelling music, just grainy footage in a dim room of Vanessa sliding documents to Trent. Then the hallway clip, Trent sealing the notary page after hours. The room did not gasp. Real shock is quieter than television. The courtroom went silent 2 days later, but the museum went silent first. Walter lowered himself into a chair without meaning to. The foundation officer closed her folder. One donor near the front whispered, "My God," as if to himself. Vanessa's face did something I had never seen before. Not panic. Calculation collapsing in real time. She said, "This is being manipulated." Elise spoke then for the first time all evening. "No," she said. "This is what your timestamps have looked like for 9 months." Miriam filed electronically from the museum office before the dessert course could be salvaged. Emergency petition, asset freeze request, motion for forensic audit, notice of fraudulent inducement under the canary clause, separate bar complaint package against Trent. Gavin signed his preliminary statement at a metal desk beside a stack of educational brochures about 19th century ironwork. By midnight, the duty judge had entered a temporary restraining order blocking Vanessa from transferring company assets, trust-linked property, or merger-related funds pending hearing. In Georgia, those orders move fast when the papers are clean and the exhibits are cruel enough. The official consequence phase took 3 weeks, not 3 minutes. That is how real justice usually works, slow enough to test your nerves, fast enough to scare the guilty. At the injunction hearing, Raj explained the forensic audit. Miriam walked the court through the affidavit defects, the fabricated notary chain, and the LLC ownership records. Gavin testified cleanly and without embellishment. Elise authenticated archival logs. Trent invoked the Fifth on advice of counsel in the related criminal inquiry. Vanessa, who had made a career out of looking composed under chandeliers, looked smaller under fluorescent court lighting, less expensive, more ordinary. The judge ordered a full asset freeze on Harbor Willow Holdings and Mercer-related discretionary accounts, removed Vanessa from interim control, and appointed a temporary receiver. He also referred the fraud and false notary issues to the district attorney. The trust house stayed protected because the canary clause worked exactly as designed once activated. My mother remained in her own kitchen with her own teacups, complaining about my driving as if nothing in the world had changed. I cannot explain how much that mattered to me. There was one final cut, and it was legal, not theatrical. Jonah's original family trust contained a disinheritance rider for any beneficiary who intentionally used fraud to dispossess a blood trustee. Vanessa had assumed no one would ever read old trust schedules closely enough to trigger it. Miriam did. Once the court found probable fraud in the control transfer scheme, Vanessa's beneficiary interest evaporated. Not because I asked for vengeance, because paper, when written carefully enough, remembers what people hope it won't. 1 year later, I was back at work 3 days a week, by choice, not necessity. Mercer Restoration Group still existed, though leaner, cleaner, and with a board that had learned the hard way that charm is not a control system. Elise was chief operating officer and still dressed like nobody had ever underestimated a woman in sensible shoes before. We laughed more than we used to. I had started taking slow evening walks again by the water, scar faded from angry red to pale silver. My blood pressure was finally boring. My mother still lived in Ardsley Park. We repaired the porch columns that summer. She supervised from a wicker chair like a retired general. Vanessa took a plea on reduced fraud-related charges tied to falsified documents and restitution. No prison epic, no operatic collapse, just supervised probation, professional disgrace, repayment orders she hated, and the permanent extinction of the polished version of herself she had sold to rooms full of donors. Trent lost his license. Last I heard, he was doing compliance consulting in Jacksonville for people with bad judgment and limited options. I saw Vanessa once after all of it, outside the courthouse on a bright Tuesday. She looked at me like she expected some speech, some final blade turned by hand. I gave her none. She said quietly, "You could have destroyed me." I said, "You did the hard part yourself." Then I kept walking. That is the lesson, if there is one. Boundaries are not cruelty. Documentation is not bitterness. Self-worth is not loud. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop begging to be seen correctly by people who profit from seeing you wrong. Sometimes justice is a folder, a clause, a timestamp, a judge who had decent sleep, and the discipline to wait until the truth has witnesses. So tell me in the comments, if your own family built a lie around your silence, would you expose them in public or let the court do the talking? And if stories like this are your kind of truth, subscribe and stay with me.